as that associated with democracy. So with that suggestion, I'll turn the program over to John Brenkman with utmost gratitude, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Esther. More on Esther in a minute. The concept behind this program, which Esther initiated something like 5 years ago or more now, was to make a connection between the Penn International Writers Festival and the college's sequence of courses in the great works of literature, which is something that all of our undergraduates are exposed to. And for people that have been around academic criticism for the last few decades, of course, the very idea of great works has been an oftentimes highly debated issue. But if one teaches that course, as I have and as many of my colleagues have, pretty soon you realize that rather than the notion that great works of literature is some narrowly conceived canon, you discover that it is an area that is so vast that it's impossible to read it all. It's beyond one's own comprehension, and certainly beyond one's embrace. So what makes for great works is would be a discussion in itself, but I think we get an interesting glimpse of that today. I've always been fond of famous comment by T.S. Eliot that every new generation of writers resets the nature of the tradition that precedes. The German writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger said something very similar, which is that important works of literature in literary history are established by later writers. It's the writers who come after who take up something that comes from earlier writers that make those earlier writers important. It's not about some official form of opinion, let alone an academic exercise. So today, you and I, all of us, have a wonderful opportunity, I think, to get a kind of living glimpse of that process, in that we have at the table 4 very accomplished contemporary writers, each of whom is going to discuss a work from the world literary tradition that has an impact on them and to which they have a special relation, not just as readers, but precisely as readers who write. Also, this is an excellent occasion to remember that the only way in which we can have a world literature is by having very active and accomplished translators. And translators are probably the least acknowledged of all of the literary creativity that goes into the production of literature and to its availability worldwide. And so here I'd like to say another word about Esther Allen, who put forward this program and conceived this, is that she herself, she's taught at the college now for several years, is an extremely accomplished translator, has won prizes. As I learned yesterday at an event where she was winning another award, she has 2 translations in press and another one nearly finished. So an extremely productive translator from both the Spanish and the French, I believe, and which is itself a testament to her talents. And as I'll introduce later, we also have a translator at the table who will help with the conversation a bit later. I'm going to introduce the writers one at a time as they make their presentation. The first one has visual effects, so we're going to start with that out of my anxiety to get past the technological aspect of this at the beginning, and so on. So it's a great pleasure to first introduce Laurie Sheck, who is at Baruch this semester. Roz Bernstein was mentioned at the outset. She's the director of the Harmon Writer in Residence program at Baruch, which brings us an excellent world-class writer every semester, year in and year out for over a decade now. Laurie is the author of 5 books of poems and a great number of literary accomplishments and recognitions. You all have the program, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the introductions because I know you want to hear the writers themselves. Her most recent book is, I think this is the most recent, yes, his most recent book is called A Monster's Notes, and it may have something to do with what we're about to hear.
Yes.
All right, so please welcome Laurie Sheck.
So Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it amazes me that Mary Shelley was 19 years old when she wrote her great novel. It's astonishing. Well, I didn't read it till I was much older. The way I came to it was my husband was getting an illness and we didn't really know it. And he started walking funny. And the way he was walking reminded me of Frankenstein's monster, but you know the kind you see in the movies or the comic books, this sort of big lug. I had never read the book. My husband did get better after a while, but he did have trouble. And I went and I read the book, and it amazed me. It was nothing like I thought, the movie version. The monster in the book was so intelligent, intellectual. He read books. He's a vegetarian. He had this wonderful monologue in which he thought about who are these human beings, this race that made me, and yet they shun and fear me. I'm not a bad guy. I don't want to hurt anybody. I'm so misunderstood. And he became really the form of the other in a way, the misunderstood other, the one who was prejudiced against. I felt so strongly for him. There I had this sick husband who couldn't talk to me anymore, and the monster started coming around with me. And we did all sorts of things together. We went to the movies. He liked Blade Runner. He just really stayed in my head. I started Googling. Well, he was Googling. He started getting interested, at least in my head, in things like genetic engineering, robotics. I imagined him in the 21st century, you know, if Mary Shelley's monster had continued. And so we spent a lot of time together. I spent 5 years with him. He became the center of my book, A Monster's Notes. But the monologue in Mary Shelley's book that the monster says, it is so beautiful. It's intelligent. He's deeply hurt. I mean, if you imagine Dr. Frankenstein wants to make this being. He constructs him out of all sorts of discarded things, parts from the graveyard, and he thinks he's going to make this wonderful being. Then he finally makes the monster. The monster opens his watery, yellow watery eyes, as Mary Shelley describes it. Victor Frankenstein takes one look at this being he's created, and he runs away. Now imagine like a little baby opening their eyes, they don't know anything, and the mother runs away. That's what it was like for the monster, really. He had to go out into the world, fend for himself, and yet because he was so big and scary looking, people were afraid of him. So he learned to read by sitting outside a cottage and overhearing someone being given reading lessons. He read Paradise Lost, Volney's Ruins of Empire, Plutarch, all sorts of things, trying to educate himself. It's true, you know, hey, he did become a murderer, but in my book, he doesn't murder anybody. And I just found Shelley's book a great inspiration and a great companionship. So my monster lives in New York City, in an abandoned building on, I think it's East 4th Street I put him on. And I spent a year at the New York Public Library at the Cullman Center working with the Shelley manuscripts as well, and I want to show you some today. What's on the screen, then I'm going to get up and show you some slides. That's the only lithograph that Mary Shelley ever approved of the monster. So if any of you have seen these comic books or movies, very different. He's sitting in a funny way, almost like a pinup. But there are books around, maybe a little hard to see. That's Victor fleeing, but in the left-hand corner is a book, and you can tell he's sort of he's kind of a thinking person. So let me go up and show you some more images that I got for you. And we'll hope my computer works. So this is the one that Mary Shelley approved. This is, oh wait, let me go back. Wait, no. This is the Golden Lion edition, I think from the 1950s. So you can already see what's happened to this poor monster. There is a quote that's actually from the original Frankenstein, but then they add on to the back of the book, and so was born the monster of Frankenstein, the freak who murdered and pillaged, who thrust naked terror into the lives of half the people in the world. This poor guy, he's already misrepresented. Whereas if you look at the quotes that are really from Shelley's book, the monster says, "When I looked around, I saw and heard none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned?" He's kind of endearing. "My form is a filthy type of yours. I am solitary and abhorred." As I read, I applied much personally to my own feelings and condition, but I was unformed of mind. I was related to none. Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? He really wanted to understand. Then he says, I love this one, "My voice, although harsh, had nothing terrible in it. Why did I live? I was bewildered and perplexed." And then he says, "I could have torn him limb from limb, but my heart sank within me as with a bitter sickness, and I refrained." He didn't really want to be a killer, even in Mary Shelley's book. So he says these really thoughtful things. So that's the Golden Lion edition. Then here he is again. This is the cover of the book. Notice 25 cents it sold for, but they show him looking at his, bloody, murderous hands, the greatest horror story of them all. But the real Frankenstein in many ways is really a love letter to reading and to books, and it's a beautiful book about loneliness, about this lonely being who wants companionship and wants to be understood. These are some comic book images that I got from the New York Public Library. You see the great, big, awful hand coming up as Victor Frankenstein, who looks like he could be sort of out of a 1950s surfing movie, maybe. He starts running away. And there he is, like rampaging through the earth, destroying everything he can in his path. Nothing to do with the monster in Shelley's book, once again. But this is what we get in the popular culture. Oh, wait, it's going in the wrong direction now. Hold on. I have to get it back to where it was. Wait. How did it went away? Wait a minute. Let me go back to my slideshow and go from the beginning. Okay. I thought this was interesting. Once again, when I was in the public library going through the manuscripts, Mary Shelley and her cohorts often wrote in something called cross-writing. To save paper, what they did is they wrote the way we would, and then they wrote over. So they wrote horizontally, and then they wrote vertically. A lot of the letters were written this way, too. And as visual art, it's actually quite beautiful. And when you're with it, you can actually read the writing. So there was a lot of this writing that I read, and I just thought it was very beautiful, and people don't often see it. Mary, by the way, wrote Frankenstein. As I said, she was 19. She ran off to the continent with the poet Percy Shelley. They ran off together, and with Mary's sister Claire. They all went together. And then with Lord Byron, when they went to France and then Switzerland, and with Lord Byron and some other friends, they decided to write ghost stories on a lark. And Mary was the one who continued hers. That's how Frankenstein began. But they all started out trying. This is just a copy there's Mary's letter to her stepsister, Claire Claremont. And also that's a lock of Mary's hair. When I was in the library opening up envelopes, and they're auctioned off by Sotheby's and things like that, whereas in Mary Shelley's day, when she was alive, she didn't have money. After her husband drowned at the age of 30, it was very hard for her to make a living, so I was opening these fancy auctioned off envelopes, and a lock of her hair fell out. So I took a photograph of it. That's Percy Shelley. When you look at writers' manuscripts, what you often find is they doodle on them, just like we do. And so Percy Shelley's are full of little drawings, including a lot of sailboats, which he liked. This is a facsimile edition of Frankenstein. And it really interested me to see Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley worked on it together. Percy Shelley wrote on it and edited it for her. And you'll see, it may be hard for you to see, but she referred to the monster as the creature. And every time she referred to him as the creature, Percy Shelley would circle it, and he'd cross out creature and write in being, which I thought was a very tender and beautiful thing to do. He wanted her to call the monster a being, not a creature. And so when you look at the manuscripts, you see Mary's handwriting and Shelley's handwriting interacting together. This is another page of the manuscript, and part of what I noticed is you'll see on the left-hand side there are numbers. And so what they were doing, we think, is they were doing their household accounts on the manuscript of Frankenstein. It's like, well, this is what we owe for our food, this is what we owe for our rent, and it was all written just right on the manuscript as well. We often don't think of manuscripts that way, but there it was. At the Morgan Library in New York City is a copy, the 1818 copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and I went and visited it one day. I spent a great afternoon with it, and what I found was Mary Shelley had annotated it. After it was published, there were things she didn't like. She had trouble with really knowing the accomplishment of this book, I think, and so she went back and she kept on revising it. So you can visit the Morgan Library and see that Mary Shelley is rewriting even once the book was published. One more. This is just, this is a painting of Shelley. When Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley had several children together, but Percy Shelley loved to sail. The problem was he couldn't swim. So he went off in a boat, and when he was 30, he drowned. And the way they knew it was him, so Mary lost her husband very, very, very early, her children, most of them, and her husband. And he wasn't found for many days, Percy Shelley. When they finally found the body, the way they knew it was him was he had a copy of Keats's book in his pocket, Keats's book of poems, and that's how they identified the body. And then his friends burned him on the shore. So, it was a rotting body, it was unsanitary. They got together, they burned him, and the story is that every part of him burned except his heart. And then Mary and some of his friends fought over the heart. And the story is that Mary got it. And she kept it in her desk. For most of her life, it eventually kind of turned to dust. But that's the story. And then that's Mary. That's one portrait we have of her. Frankenstein was really her great book. And it's full of a lot of loss. Mary Shelley's mother died 11 days after her birth. And I think that a lot of that sense of loneliness and loss ends up being in the book of Frankenstein in one way or another. So anyhow, I learned a great deal from her. And in A Monster's Notes, Mary Shelley is a character in my book. So is her sister Claire Claremont and Shelley, and I use the manuscripts. But the monster, as I mentioned, he takes notes on lots of things because he's still alive. They're all dead, and he misses them terribly. In my book, Mary Shelley doesn't invent the monster. She meets him as a child of 8 when she's sitting by her mother's grave, and he reads to her. And then he mysteriously disappears, and she misses him. Anyhow, what I'm going to show you as an excerpt from my book is one of the notes that the monster takes. He takes notes on things that he's interested in. As I said, he Googles, he reads books. So this is the notes on the Earth seen from space. And it's his thoughts about that. So let me see if I can work this computer in a way where I can actually get it going. Here it is. So this will be the monster talking.
over and over the word fragile. It looked so fragile, so delicate, that if you touched it with a finger, it would crumble and fall apart. This from James Irwin, crew member of Apollo 15. Astronaut Lauren Acton spoke of seeing it contained in the thin, moving, incredibly fragile shell of the biosphere. To Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in space, the Earth looked touchingly alone. And when Vitaly Sevastyanov was asked by ground control what he saw, he replied, "Half a world to the left, half a world to the right. I can see it all. The Earth is so small." Neil Armstrong said, "I put up my thumb and shut one eye, and my thumb blotted out the planet Earth. I didn't feel like a giant. I felt very, very small." And Ulf Meerwald, "For the first time in my life, I saw the horizon line as curved, accentuated by a thin seam of dark blue light. I was terrified by its fragile appearance." Is this what frightened you? Is this what you sought to combat and to flee? This fragility, this somehow knowledge, even then, before anyone had ever left the earth or seen it from a distance, of how small it is and delicate, as we are too, how finite, how beside the point, how fleeting. Might this account partly for my monstrous proportions, as if you were building a shield, a fortress of flesh, as if the vertiginous wings of blood in us could somehow be made to tremble less. But I am a blunt and narrow piece of materiality, imprinting and imprinted, as were you. Footprints, strands of broken hair dropped here and there. On March 18, 1965, Alexei Leonov exited the main capsule of Voskhod 2 by pushing himself headfirst out of the opening. A 16-foot lifeline held him to the ship. If it broke, he would drift off forever. Although the spacecraft traveled at great speed, there was no air rushing past him to let him feel it. He spun slowly for 10 minutes. But when the co-pilot Bayev told him to come back, he didn't want to return. He didn't want to return, and yet it seems a lonely thing, that feeling of nothing pushing back. Several months later, Edward White walked in space for 20 minutes, though the term's deceptive, as the motion is a free fall or floating. Seen from 120 miles away, Earth was nearly featureless. When he returned to the spaceship, he had lost 5 kilograms of body mass, and 2 kilograms of perspiration had collected in his boots. But he too didn't want to return to the capsule. When told to come back to the spacecraft, he said, "This is the saddest moment of my life." His co-pilot pulled him back in. And you will work in sorrow the fields, as if your laboratory were a field, a wound always to be worked, a not-quiteness, a rivenness of mind needing to be healed. But when he floated there, in that region without weight or mass or shadow, all fields fell away, all shattering turned soft and pliant, as if there were no need anymore either to build or to destroy. But how my mind builds and destroys you over and over. On January 27, 1967, 2 years after his spacewalk, Edward White died in a fire at Launch Complex 34 on the Cape Canaveral Air Station. He had entered Apollo 1 for a simulated countdown, along with command pilot Grissom and pilot Roger Chaffee, when the fire broke out. Years later, White's wife took her own life. How strange to see the earth from the sky and then come back, To float in space like that, barely tethered, Earth a modest, uncrowned thing. So peaceful and so fragile, one called it. The size of a marble or a pearl hanging delicately, said another, and another, but I did not see the Great Wall. Still, there are many practicalities to be addressed, as you would have known even from your rudimentary laboratory. It's a very sobering feeling to be up in space and realize that one's safety factor was determined by the lowest bidder on a government contract, the astronaut Alan Shepard pointed out. And Neil Armstrong spoke of a feeling that was complex, unforgiving. Lyndon Johnson said, "It's too bad, but the way the American people are, now that they have all this capability, instead of taking advantage of it, they'll probably just piss it away." But what would it mean to take advantage? And what of how small and of how fragile? Over and over the word fragile describing this world that has taught me such resistance, the heart of it and brutal and yet still. Numerous inventions made for space have been adapted by private industry, resulting in such things as studless snow tires, scratch-proof eyeglasses, White needed to shield his eyes from the extreme glare of sunlight, the 5-year flashlight and cordless power hand tools. The U.S. Space Walk of Fame Foundation was formed in the 1990s as a major component of a redevelopment master plan designed for Titusville's urban waterfront. There you can visit the gift shop at the museum and treat yourself, a friend, or a relative to a truly unique space-related gift. When Leonov and White floated in space, they didn't want to come back. They couldn't have known this beforehand. And what is a footstep then after that, and the feeling of earth so fragile, so small beneath a shoe, or the thin tether of breath, or a name, or a day, a boundary, a theory, a bond?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Our next, the next writer is Ib Michael from Denmark, a novelist and poet who's also had a long-standing interest in Central America, a widely traveled writer. And as you're going to see from the text he's talking about, also widely traveled historically in his own reading and mind. So.
Thank you. I would define a classic as a book, tale, or manuscript with a universal theme to be read or retold throughout all ages, not necessarily as a strictly literary work. In that sense, the Inca Chronicle is to be read as a classic. And I'm going to explain to you what the Inca Chronicle is. When the Spaniards conquered Peru, ancient Peru, in 1535, an Inca prince was born, and he was given the name Wamam Poma, his Indian name that meant Wamam, eagle, and Poma, puma or mountain lion. And his full name was to be Don Felipe Wamam Poma de Ayala. And he wrote a chronicle that was called the First New Chronicle and Good Government. This was actually written as a letter to the King of Spain. So at that time when he started to write his chronicle, he was an old man. He had seen his entire people, he had seen his entire culture disappear. He had seen 99% of the indigenous population of ancient Peru disappear totally. He had seen the remnants of a great culture, of great cities that was great wonders of the New World disappear totally. And he decided to write a letter to the King of Spain to plead for justice. He had a dream. The old man had a dream. The king will read my letter. The king will understand that injustice was done to my people. The king will understand everything, and I will finally come through with my chronicle. That was his idea when he started to write it. Being an old man, he knew so much, and there were so many details that he wanted to include in his tale to the King of Spain, that his letter grew on him. And he also figured out that he would have to make a lot of beautiful drawings so that the king should not be too bored reading his long story about his people. So he made 400 beautiful drawings and collected that in a manuscript. And towards the end, when he was losing his eyesight, he was getting old, and he was at that time exiled from society. He was living in a distant Andean community, in a village in the Andean mountains. And he wanted himself personally to hand in the letter to the king, to the authorities in the town of Lima. The town of the kings, it was also called at that time. So he loaded his mule with a few necessities, and he was followed by his grandchild when he started out for his voyage from the high Andes all the way down to Lima to deliver his manuscript to the authorities. And this story made such an impact on me that now I have to tell you that this strange and rare manuscript actually exists till this day as the rarest gem in the Royal Library of Copenhagen. And nobody really knows how it ended in Copenhagen. And of course, being a student of Indian languages, I was interested. But when I was a young man, I thought that Don Felipe Wamamporma didn't really interest me because he was not a revolutionary Indian. He was a Christian, actually. He had been brought up by the new rulers of the world, and he, belonging himself to the nobility, he had had a good education. They taught him how to read and write. So he felt like a Christian man. And I didn't like that when I was young. But then I started to read his manuscript because some years ago they put it all out on the internet. So you could follow his drawings and you could follow his handwritten text. And when I looked at his drawings, I had the feeling that I was just looking over his shoulder while he was doing this incredible manuscript. And you know, in the end, I was so much into it that I started to write the story of how this manuscript was written in this Andean village and how it ended up in Copenhagen. So now you can ask me. I'm the only one that really knows it. I wrote a novel, and it was called The Pope of the Indies. The Indies being the ancient American countries, because, as you all know, Columbus thought that he had found the way to India. So it was called The Pope of the Indies because the Inca prince, and he was a prince, his mother was an Inca queen called Mama Oclo, and he was a prince, really, and who loved very much his parents. But the Spanish authorities had stripped him at that time of everything. His name, they said, we have a poor Indian here, calls himself Lázaro, and claims to be an Inca prince. What is this? He lost his properties. All his properties was taken away from him, and he was driven into exile into this village. That was the true story of his life. And without no bitterness at all, the old man starts to write the story of what had happened, of his parents, of his grandparents, of the grand culture that he had belonged to, of the new world and what they'd got and so on. And I found out by reading the text that it was much more interesting that he actually defined himself as a Christian, because that gave a ring to his words that was even more fantastic. Because he couldn't hide his anger. He couldn't hide what had been done to his people. So when he found it very difficult to hide what was going on, and still having this idea that this letter is being read by the King of Spain, he would change into his native language, Quichua, and write a part of his manuscript in Quichua. And being also a very educated Indian, he could sometimes change into another Indian language called Aymara, spoken today in Bolivia, and write parts of his manuscripts there. So if you translate the parts that he wrote in Quichua and in Aymara, sometimes his words become very harsh. Well, he knew, of course, that the King of Spain wouldn't be offended because he wouldn't understand a word of it. So that's how this manuscript came into it. The old man couldn't stop. So when he started to write the letter, he just had to keep going as long as his mind would keep working for him. In the end, when he came close to Lima, and was going to deliver his manuscript. And when we finally reach the last page of the manuscript, you will see a sentence that ends the Inca Chronicle, and that sentence is delivered to the city of the kings and contrasigned by the people that were supposed to take hand of the letter to the king and send it on to Madrid. And the rest of that page is completely empty. No name ever appeared under his sentence. His dream was never fulfilled. Nobody ever signed the manuscript. Nobody ever received that manuscript. And soon after he died in Lima, a poor Indian, as so many other poor Indians, and disappeared totally from history. And we wouldn't have known about him till this day if this manuscript hadn't turned up in the Royal Library of Copenhagen. This is a magical story, but it's a real one. And I, of course, tried to figure out what could have happened with the manuscript. And I should say that making my novel about the old man, Don Felipe, I was in contact with the scientist at the Harvard University, Rolena Adorno, who is a great expert on the Inca Chronicle. And each time I had a question, I emailed her and she answered me back, and that was a very nice conversation we had in that manner. Here you might see the title page of the Ancient Chronicle, and you see the title of my novel about the old man called The Pope of the Indies, because this old Indian had figured out strange things happening in our countries in Europe. We have so many kings, the King of Spain, the King of Italy, the King of Germany, the King of Denmark, and only one Pope. So himself, being of Inca origin, decided, I should be the Pope of the Indies. So that's why this is part of my novel. We must distinguish here. I interpret that this is why he's so fascinated by the Pope. And when you see him kneeling down in front of the King of Spain and in front of the Pope on his throne, you will notice that he's wearing a fur coat, what do you call hermelin, fur coat with small tails, made of small tails. And that's because, I mean, there was never an Indian being dressed like that, but he, coming from a culture where icon and picture and images was everything, he knew this is the only way I can tell them that I'm actually a prince. So that's why he looks like a prince, a European prince, in his own drawings always. So I don't know if I really should tell you how it ended up, because we do know something about it. But it's more or less like, it seems like some years after he died, a Spanish monk called Buenaventura wrote a chronicle. And this chronicle is based on his chronicle. So we know that he didn't hand it in to the authorities, but somehow a Spanish friar got hold of it and wrote his own chronicle. That's one thing. So that chronicle somehow ended up in Spain, probably taken to Spain by the monk himself. And after that, a Danish ambassador who had served for a long time and was a great collector of manuscripts got hold of this manuscript. Either he found it as a collector, or maybe he was given, when he resigned, was given as a gift from the King of Spain. Then he was taken to Denmark, and then he became knighted, and the King of Denmark, Frederik III, was a very learned man at that time. He was a bishop before he became a king, and he included in his collection of books this rare manuscript. And that's why we have it till this day, because on his collection of books, the Royal Library was founded. So the Inca Chronicle never came to the Royal Library. The Royal Library was born with the gem already. And this gem today, in 2007, was put on the list, UNESCO's World Heritage. I give you the first few sentences of my novel. Of course, it's based on facts, as you might hear already, but also it's based on my own interpretations and my own fantasy. And the narrator of the story is not the Inca prince himself. It's a deaf and dumb sheep girl living in the Indian village where he is writing the letter to the king. And he has the good sense to teach her how to write. This deaf and dumb girl is living in anarchy and chaos until this old man teaches her how to write, how to establish relationship between words. And she becomes so grateful for that, that she dies. She ends up dying for the old man. But in the beginning, and it struck me when I read one of the sentences of the Frankenstein monster. It might strike you too, because this is how my novel begins. Once I was no one. I was a sheep girl, mute fool among the animals. I had been set to guard a sheep in skirts. I took them to the mountain pastures where the air was thin and the upland glow congealed to thistles on my cheeks. I drank of the same streams, and at night, when the wind swept down the mountainside with a coat of ice, I borrowed the closeness of their bodies, snuggling against their fur and body heat. I smelled as they did, but wondered why my skin was bare. I was more fearful than the animals. They had each other. I had no one who was like me. For I live in a world without sound, in a bell jar where no one can call me. It has always been that way. Then again, I can see far with my sharper vision. Though I do not hear the sound, I sense the invisible force that moves all others and may be read on their lips. I imagine sound having color, outlines, and rhythm. It must be visible to others because at the opening of a mouth, people in the village change directions. They start working together, digging the soil, catching their animals, or they meet in the plaza where they stand before one another, taking turns moving their lips. I know they see something that I'm not seeing, because all kinds of expressions glide over their faces. Laughter and gentleness turn to grief. The thin veneer of friendliness changes to seething anger or hatred as soon as the other turns away. Something exists in the world that I do not understand. I have learned that its name is talk, but have not learned to say the word. So,
Next, I'm very happy to introduce Giannina Braschi, poet, essayist, fiction writer from Puerto Rico, who will probably also at some point talk a little bit about her approach to language in her writing, and who, well, I'll let her explain, is not talking about a particular author, but about the way in which the literary tradition has come into her own work.
You know, like those runners that run backwards in order to make the big leap into the future. So I run backward and I capture Hamlet and Zarathustra. Hamlet was carrying the body of Polonius and Zarathustra was carrying the body of the Overman. And I said, well, I too carry my dead body. And they said, who invited you to this burial? I said, I'm going to bury the 20th century. Well, I don't know if I curse myself because this was in 1998, but then I moved downtown, 2 blocks south of the World Trade Center, and there I saw the towers falling on my head. And then I said, you know, this is the burial of the 20th century, and I'm going to the Statue of Liberty, and I'm going to rescue Segismundo, which is the boys in the dungeon of the Statue of Liberty. Under the skirt of liberty, this prisoner is there, and he represents all the immigrants of the Latin countries that we are 50 million Latins in the United States, and we're still in the dungeon. Now, what I did in this book was take these 50 millions of Latin people, and I brought them to the crown. And I'm going to read you the first fragment of the United States of Banana. Walking with Zarathustra and Hamlet to the Statue of Liberty to meet Segismundo. There, at the Fulton Market, where the 3 roads intersect, was the point where Hamlet, Giannina, and Zarathustra first met. The 3 had been walking the streets like mad without stopping to rest until they came to the South Street seaport, where flies were harrowing around the halo of the fish market that smelled like the rot of Chinatown. They recognized one another and walked toward each other with dead bodies on their back. Giannina, I'm burying the sardine, the dead body I carry on my back. Zarathustra, a little fish in a little coffin, and for this little stinky thing we came from so far. Giannina, look, it's moving, it's still alive. Zarathustra, it's so salty and ugly, it itches and bites. Giannina, it worked its whole life in the sludge of oil and vinegar. I'll sprinkle incense, myrrh, and a pound of gold to be buried with it under the sand. Hamlet, hurry up, the ferry will leave without us. Giannina, you have no idea how much I have suffered under the influence of this rigorous but regarded sardine, not a warrior but a soldier, making me bow to its regimen of passive-aggressive work. No traveling was allowed, no smoking allowed, no pets allowed. No one could get near me because the sardine would stink and its stink would bite. Sometimes it would fly around the rim, but it would always dive back into the can of sardine looking for its paycheck. Every 2 weeks, it brought me a salary, the stinky sardine, and I brought home all I could buy with that salary. Confinement, imprisonment, depending on a salary made me salivate, but it blew my mind to dust, the dust that blows around and makes you cough, but you hardly can see it because it's made of dust. But I'm not made of dust, I'm made of flesh. And making love to the little sardine drove me crazy. It was such a little fish, it barely filled my mouth. I could hardly eat it. I grew hungry, hungry for a big fish. God help me, no more fish. Please, no clams, no oysters. Please, nothing shell or scale, nothing salted, nothing fin or fang, because it had fangs. The sardine had fangs, and it bit me like a rabid squirrel. It must have known I wanted to bury it. Its fangs were long, and its screams were shrill, and it held grudges, and it had bones to pick. It blamed me for keeping it down, but all I wanted was its liberation from the can. I wanted it to breathe clean air and to sing. Your mouth is already open. Now take a deep breath, little fishy, and sing. Sing a song of love. You know my chords are made of vibrant colors. You know I too come from the sea. But I don't come with grudges in my fangs. I come with wings to fly from your sting. I hate sardines. Zarathustra, then why do you eat them? Giannina, because I detest their helplessness. I wouldn't eat a lion. It would eat me first. I eat what is weaker than me. I like lamb. I watch a grazing lamb and my mouth waters. I could eat it alive, but not sardines. They're always dead. They never leave. They're dead even when they're alive, always with their mouth open, begging for water. And I don't mind beggars, but sardines are not beggars. They're squirmers. They beg for water, but what they really want is to eat you alive with their deadliness, which is a plague, a virus, bacteria, something contagious that kills you without killing you. They open their mouth to beg for water, but do nothing but gulp the drought and wait for water with their mouth open as if snoring, which is worse than imploring. They are beggarly beggars that don't even beg. They are too dead to beg, and they are deadly contagious. It's their deadliness that lingers over me every day of my life, the dead inertia of the sardine that obeys and begs for water, gallons of water, and does what it's asked to do in spite of no water, and denies itself so much that it doesn't realize it doesn't have a being anymore, and it lets itself be canned, always with its open mouth saying, "Drop dead, but give me drops of water. I don't want to be buried alive. I want to survive. I'm a salaried sardine. Give me more money." That's why they are so salty and ugly. They itch and bite because they're salivating for salty salaries, salty, salaried sardines. Zarathustra is not a sardine, it's a big fish. Giannina, the coffin is small, but the stench is immense. Zarathustra, would you allow my little pet to be buried in the same hole of the hollow tree where you left the tightrope walker? Hamlet, and may I please leave the putrefied carrion in the same hollow tree? Giannina, we're bearing sameness, the aesthetic principle of sameness, the three together at the same time, holding hands, bearing bodies in the same hollow tree, and running, free from freedom, free. Hamlet, more myrrh, more gold, more incense to purify the air, and there's no blood spilled. Giannina, not this time. This is the burial, the enclosure of the dead. This dust will purify the air, hanging there while I finish the rites. Zarathustra, I have been hibernating. Giannina, I have been stagnating. Hamlet, I've been trying to figure out what I should do with Polonius' body. I might as well do what you did, Zarathustra, leave the body in the hole of a tree. But before I leave it in the hole of a tree, find a hermit to give me 2 pieces of bread so I can give a piece of bread to the dead. Zarathustra, I already left the corpse in the hole of a tree. Now I need to find the Overman, somebody who rescues me from the principle of equality. All men are created equal. Maybe that is why they are men, because they have equal eyes, ears, and noses, and they have voices that bark. But I'm looking for inequalities. My thirst is unequal. Satiety is not satiated, and it's not water I need, but networkers. Giannina, so after all, you're a networker. You work the internet. Hamlet. I'm a fishmonger at the market, smelling everything that is putrefied. I smell the stench of death, and I have not gotten to my goal. Zarathustra, I'm still walking the tightrope, trying to get to the other side. Hamlet, do you realize we're posthumous? We're talking after. Giannina, speak for yourself. I'm not yet. Zarathustra, but you don't count with your broken English. You cut the line. You're not invited, little fox. You think you're a visionary just for saying, I'm going to bury the 20th century. In 1998, you said it, and here we are in 2006, and you're still trying to bury the body. Hamlet, all these bodies are pestering the annals of literature. We have too many unresolved issues. Giannina, when I said I will bury the 20th century, everybody, not just me, went looking for a dead body. When Princess Di and Dodie died, people thought, oh, this is the funeral we've been waiting. And when John Kennedy died, Americans appropriated the death of Lady Di and said, this is our American dead prince. But they were inconsequential deaths that were not the beginning of a war, nor the end of a century, but accidentals, incidentals, and their bodies were buried. Hamlet, wait a minute. The death of Polonius was an accidental death. So was the death of the tightrope walker, and Antigona's brothers were casualties of war. Giannina, I'm not here to analyze literary texts. You did what you did. I do what I do. What we have in common is our brotherly love. We bury bodies and we never give birth. Although I'm in labor most of my life, in labor like Zarathustra, not like Hamlet. You're a suicide bomber and a camel with too many grudges. You should have been what you are, a poet. But instead, the hunchback took center stage because you were possessed by your father's ghost, which was the absence of present life in you. You did not live, you remember. That's why you didn't have an objective correlative. What you had were regrets that you didn't become the poet you should have been. You should have given up the crown and followed the path of Yorick, the path of music and love. Your feelings were overwhelming, and they overwhelm you. Why didn't you write them down? Hamlet, words, words, words. Giannina, what were you reading? That is the question. Instead of writing, loving, living in the experience that is, not in the regrettable state of what was. I don't want to fall into the pit of ground zero again. Why are we here? Let's state the fact of our Last Supper. Zarathustra, we're gathered here to break bread with our dead bodies. Giannina, I found my dead body in a manhole 2 blocks south of the World Trade Center, where I was living when the Twin Towers collapsed. Even now, they are finding bones in manholes. And as long as there are bones, I still have lines to write. This is just a little beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The final writer with translator is Gabriela. I know I'm going to just murder this. Adamesteanu. Oh, there we go. Romanian novelist and journalist. We might ask her more about that later. From 1991 to 2005, she edited a political weekly in Romania. Her novels include a novel that has been translated into English called Wasted Morning, a psychological study of an elderly survivor of Romania's 20th century. And there's the book, very nice. Her translator-interpreter today is Ojna Radu, and
yes, sure. She will help me. I will try to answer this question, frequent question about the influences the classic authors to our work, to my work. And because I receive many times this question, I thought about it, and what I discovered in my mind, it was that the authors that I loved very much, like Tolstoy or like Proust, or the author that I read later, like Philip Roth or Saul Bellow, I couldn't find in my work any influence. It was surprising for me, but I couldn't make any relation between them and me. But thinking again, when I received the invitation for this panel, I remember that in a French review, it was mentioned the name of Henry James, linked to my this novel, Wasted Morning, translated in English recently. It made me the opportunity to reread Henry James. This book, this is a Romanian book translated in 70, and Portrait of a Lady. And I discovered a lot of similarities between my novel and this one. Really, it was a discovery for me, and I want to explain a little how is my book, Wasted Morning. Really, there are two novels in a novel. That means the first part is about the 80s in communist Romania, the last year of Ceausescu's regime. And for the second part of the book, there is a novel about the atmosphere in the upper middle class, intellectual environment before the First World War. And because it's more complicated for me to explain the similarities between James and me, I will, excuse me, and I will tell in Romanian, and Oana will help me to say something about the style, James' styles, and what I discovered in my book. Era, în primul rând, o lume asemănătoare, o lume care nu trăia cu grija zilei de mâine.
First of all, there was a world, the one in this second part of the novel, of my novel, and the one in James's books, was a world and a class that didn't live with the fear of what tomorrow will bring.
Mi-ar fi fost greu să imaginez singura această lume, pentru că eu trăiam într-una total diferită.
It would have been difficult to me to imagine and conceive such a world because I lived in one that was totally different.
Și acum eu mi-am amintit că am început cartea cu 10 ani înainte să o termin.
And I remember now that I started the book 10 years before finishing it, so it took 10 years.
Și în momentul când am început-o, eram mult mai tânără decât personajele mele. De fapt, ele aveau dublu vârstei mele.
So when I started the book, I was half the age of my characters.
Și după ce am scris o parte despre bătrânețea lor în timpul regimului Ceaușescu, lucruri pe care eu le cunoșteam, a trebuit să mă opresc pentru că nu puteam să intru în memoria personajelor mele.
And after writing a part of the book about these characters as old people during the communist regime, I had to stop because it was difficult for me to conceive their memories of a different world.
Atunci am citit cărți de istorie și atunci am citit și romane din acel timp. Și atunci, bineînțeles, m-am întâlnit cu Henry James, cu Proust mă întâlnisem înainte.
And that's when I started to read a lot of history books as well as literary works dealing with that particular period. And it was at that time that I met Henry James. Proust I had already read before.
Există, nu am copiat, cum s-ar putea crede, cartea aceasta și nici scene și nici personaje din Henry James.
I haven't copied the book or themes or characters from Portrait of a Lady.
Există ficțiunea mea, însă există o atmosferă în care m-am recunoscut pe mine și am recunoscut în același timp romanele acestui autor.
It is my book and my imagination in it, but there is an atmosphere that I recognize in these books and this author.
E vorba de scene de salon, de discuții în jurul orelor de ceai, de discuții despre identități. La Henry James există, așa cum sigur știți, discuția despre americani și europeni și privirea critică pe care o are mai degrabă spre europeni.
So there are in my books, similarly to Henry James, scenes of salon where people gather together around at tea time, having intellectual conversations or conversations about other things, but also discussions about identity, which are very strong in my book. As you know, in Henry James, there are this discussion about America and Europe and his critical, or the character's critical takes on Europe in particular.
Și în același timp există mai multe perspective ale personajelor, fiecare cu punctul său de vedere, ceea ce am descoperit acum, Henry James teoretizase în prefața unei ultime ediții a acestui roman, vorbind despre House of Fiction.
And also another thing having in common is that there are different perspectives, different characters with their own take on a particular situation. And I have discovered now, looking back at Henry James, that this is something that he had formalized in his foreword to talking about the House of Fiction. And I'm going to read just a very tiny fragment from this foreword written by Henry James about the different perspective. He and his neighbors are watching the same show, but one seeing more where the other sees less, one seeing black where the other sees white, one seeing big where the other sees small, one seeing coarse where the other sees fine, and so on, and so on.
Cartea mea este în mare parte construită pe întâlnirea mai multor puncte de vedere, toate motivate individual, dar și social. Diferențe de perspectivă care construiesc un întreg, din care un întreg în final totuși ușor ambigu.
My entire book is really structured around these different perspectives of different characters, each of them with a strong motivation, both individually, an individual, but also a social or class motivation. And it's this encounter that really builds the novel, at which at the very end it builds a whole, which at the very end is, because of this, ambiguous.
Cum sigur știți, Henry James este new-yorkez sau ca și new-yorkez, este născut într-o familie înstărită, este fratele unui foarte cunoscut filozof, a trăit foarte mult în Europa, iar cu un an înainte de a muri, adică în 1915, chiar a refuzat cetățenia americană, adoptând-o pe cea engleză, în semn de revoltă, pentru că Statele Unite întârziau să intre în război alături de Europa.
As you know, he was a New Yorker coming from a well-to-do family, the brother of a well-known philosopher, and he lived a lot in Europe, and it was in 1915 that he gave up his citizenship, his American citizenship, to protest the United States not entering the war.
Există în cartea mea, fără îndoială, nu există niciun ecou a acestor lucruri, există însă o privire critică asupra identității românești și aceea, din păcate, este valabilă și în mare parte astăzi.
There is no echo of these particular things in my book, but there is an echo of this question of identity, and in my case, it's about a critical take on Romanian identity, much of which is also still valid today.
Și acum vreau să rog pe Oana să citească un fragment din cartea mea, în care eu recunosc că acest roman scris, îmi dau seama, cu voință cândva, à la manière de Henry James.
So I will now read a very brief fragment from the book, from the second part, which was written willingly à la manière de Henry James. The book was written in 1984. The current book published last year by Northwestern is translated by Patrick Kamiller. This is an excerpt from chapter 6, Tea Time. Keeping his glasses on his nose, the professor relaxes his lean frame on the chair and allows his soft gaze to glide out of the large, clear window towards the clematis plants on the terrace. The sky is perfectly clear, too intensely blue for an autumn day, and from time to time the golden coronas of the trees in the garden sparkle metallically in the soft, honeyed light. For a week now, the perverse late summer heat has been weighing on everyone and making them look haggard and dreamy-eyed. This morning, however, a cold mist enveloped the garden, thick and compact like the steam that pours from a defective ship's boiler. Toward midday, the warmth and golden light returned, but the professor saw a group of inoffensive white clouds in the implausibly blue sky. A sign of a change in the weather? Looking gently at the young man, his face concedes that, insofar as you are a creature of habit, devoid of idealism, you may be living a life of isolation so long as politics and the activity of society are proceeding normally, but that those who work for the cultural improvement of a nation rarely fall victim to such an illusion. For the first result of culture is to strengthen relations of solidarity in your society, both horizontally with people living today and vertically with previous generations. So, even if they think of themselves as autonomous individuals, perhaps even as the center of the universe, those who sincerely work in the service of culture must feel, at least some of the times, that they are part of a single organism. At difficult times like the present, when collective interests are beginning to take first place, you will find it impossible in good faith to keep your fate separate from that of others. And if, despite everything, you persist in trying to do it by honest means, the inevitable egoism that comes simply from protecting your own corner will make you bend in one way or another to the atmosphere of the times. Of course, it will depend on you whether you make minimal adjustments or go all the way and grovel in the dust. But even if you mobilize all your reserves of dignity, not an easy feat to keep up, especially in the long term. The results may still be unsatisfactory, as in a badly lit room where flowers grow at a strange angle, neither rising nor creeping, but keeping a precarious balance shored up by sap and cellulose. He's almost panting by the end of this long bout of oratory. The emotion is unjustified, as at the national festivities on the 10th of May, when the first fanfare brings disgraceful tears to his eyes. Only this time the lump in his throat is due to nervous fatigue. His bony hand now reaches out more decisively to the table, no longer mindful of the need for Sophie's approval. And his gestures are swift and sure as he raises a cigarette to his mouth and flicks the lighter. It is at such moments that his original ascendancy over Sophie reasserts itself, over that white shape listening motionless in its silk-tasseled shawl. She is doubtless aware that something has dispelled her power, but she waits patiently, confident that it will be restored to her in the natural course of things. The professor continues to smoke quietly, his pale, balding head thrown back. His mind is no longer on the afternoon rush of excitement, and he is filled with a petty, childish sense of victory. Victory over whom? Over what? On the sofa, Margot yawns unobtrusively and examines her boots. She still considers them new, even though it is 3 months since her beau-frère Stefan brought them for her from Vienna. On the same occasion, he gave her a blue-eyed porcelain doll that had real hair and said, "Mama, Mama," when you tilted it. A doll? What will she do with a doll at her age? Sophie asked indelicately. What do you mean? Stefan retorted. She's still a child, isn't she? As usual, he was influenced by Sophie's opinion. He turned his head from one to the other, then back again. He wanted to stroke Margot paternally on the head, but as usual, he only managed to touch her ear with his fingertips. Soon there'll be another one to play with it, Anna hinted. Try as she may to be discreet, she could hardly wait for an opportunity to open her mouth. And they had a funny look in their eyes, Sophie, Stefan, and Anna. Really, how could they imagine she didn't understand such allusions? There's many a time, now for example in the salon, when she looks at them and is sure she understands more than they do. They, on the other hand, like her classmates, don't know her at all. How terrible it is to be alone and misunderstood. Yesterday evening she played the piano for hours and wept bitter tears, convinced that she will die young, soon after her first ball and her first kiss. They will dress her in white and hold a Catholic mass, because that will be her last wish.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful set of presentations and readings. We're kind of up against the clock here. Also, Esther, we have book signings and stuff? Yes, all right. So I want to give people a chance to speak with the authors, buy books, sign them, and so on. So, but before we adjourn here, we could take 1 or 2 questions from the audience, maybe, if someone has a burning question, or you can take up conversation with the authors in a few minutes. So please, thank the entire panel, and they will be up in the lobby shortly.